The phenomenon of alleged UFO sightings and alien abductions, distinctly in America, could arguably be seen as once one of the more popular trends within the warped and often delusional culture of conspiracy, at least when it comes to the more fantastical theories about the horrors we supposedly cannot see. Today, it's become more of an underground culture, with academic researcher David Clark telling the Boston Globe that they've retreated from public view and just keep to themselves, while prominent skeptic Michael Shermer simply pointed out how difficult it is to maintain such a zeitgeist when the ubiquity of phones means pics or it didn't happen. However, when it comes to the topic of alien abduction films, Hollywood surprisingly never really took advantage of real-life stories, mainly because it was easier to just come up with their own like they had been doing for years prior to some of the most publicized cases. Thus, there was no need to shell out money for the legal rights to stories that practically all followed a similar formula anyway. I mean, off the top of my head, the only somewhat major example of a genuine based on true story that I can think of is 1993's Fire in the Sky, which attempted to faithfully adapt Travis Walton's highly debated but graphically detailed abduction in November 1975. The thing is, despite how terrifying some of these stories made the concept out to be, and the profitable niche culture that spawned out of it, for some reason, pseudo-realistic alien stories just did not find the same mainstream cinematic appeal as its true-life supernatural equivalent. It became predominantly relegated to television, with The X-Files being the most globally mainstream depiction, while for films, I would argue that many later attempts to break through did so by masking themselves within other trending subgenres at the time, which in the case of this topic includes found footage, demonic possession, and traditional paranormal hauntings. In fact, perhaps the most defining cinematic encapsulation of the American UFO zeitgeist was Steven Spielberg's 1977 Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a title which derived from J. Allen Hynek's original 3 classifications for UFO sightings. However, while Spielberg could only take us to the third kind, it took over 30 years for another film to finally take one giant leap into the supposed fourth kind. Oh, what? You think you can come up with a better segue? Anyway, before we begin, this video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Sometimes when I'm doing research for a video like this one, or just aimlessly browsing down the rabbit hole of the World Wide Web, I'll get a little warning about websites being potentially compromised, reminding me that my location and personal data could be vulnerable to anyone looking to harvest it. However, one of the many advantages of using ExpressVPN is that it safely masks my IP address, changes my location, and transfers my data through an encrypted tunnel to ensure my privacy is protected, giving me constant peace of mind. Without ExpressVPN, it's like going skydiving without a parachute or using a public toilet with the door wide open. We far too often take our online safety and security for granted, especially when using public Wi-Fi in cafes, like I frequently do, where anyone could be exploiting it. With the simple press of a button, ExpressVPN uses an accessible and non-intrusive interface to tell you precisely what you need to know about your online privacy, including their assurance that your data is completely leak-proof. And look, if you're simply just someone who likes to live life on the edge, why not use it to geographically unlock films unavailable for streaming in your country? For example, if you're using Netflix outside the UK, why not access this video's topic, The Fourth Kind, on Netflix UK by selecting a UK location from the list available? With rave reviews by reputable tech critics, 24/7 customer support, and a 30-day money-back guarantee, find out how you can get 3 months free by visiting expressvpn.com/Ryan. And now, let's enter the fourth kind. Olatunde Osunsami's 2009 psychological horror The Fourth Kind was a fairly successful, if indeed conflicting film at the time of its release. While far from controversial by any means, it caused a fair few moans and groans amongst many critics for its aggressive marketing campaign, which went far beyond simply claiming to be based on true events, and straight up declared that it was using actual archival footage to recount a series of strange and startling alleged alien abductions in Nome, Alaska in October 2000. In fact, Universal was so egregious about calling it a true story that local news publishers understandably sued them for fabricating fake news articles using their actual brands, potentially hurting their reputation. I can see wanting to replicate the successful viral marketing of the Blair Witch Project and Cloverfield, but Universal definitely pushed their luck with how insistent they were in their promotion, which possibly stemmed from wanting to cash in on the mega hype train generated by the closely marketed Paranormal Activity. The film begins with a meta-introduction where lead actress Milla Jovovich addresses the audience and explains to us that what we're watching is a dramatic reconstruction pieced together with the help of video and audio recordings to paint a complete picture of what actually happened, and ends by encouraging us to be open-minded as we draw our own conclusions.
Please be advised that some of what you're about to see is extremely disturbing.
Now, here's the thing, the story we're about to explore is total horseshit. There is fundamentally no factual basis behind it, and so being an absolute work of fiction, morally it's completely harmless and no different from other mockumentaries of its kind, with its all too serious poker face sort of being just part of its charm, like, yeah, you tell yourself you're real if you want, I won't judge you, wee whippersnapper. At most, it very loosely ties itself into a series of disappearances in Alaska that involved having the FBI come in to investigate in 2005, where their conclusion was linked to, surprise surprise, not alien abductions, but alcohol consumption and freezing temperatures, given Alaska is in the barren arsehole of nowhere. Hell, on the topic of embellishment, Anchorage Daily News reporter Kyle Hopkins even went as far as to point out that for such a beautifully shot movie, Nome, Alaska doesn't look anything like this. It's just an empty, flat, frozen wasteland. No offense if you happen to live there somehow. Actually, just for comparison's sake, 30 Days of Night, which takes place on the other side of Alaska, is a more accurate representation of the setting. That's how painfully fictional The Fourth Kind is. Anyway, the central framing device of The Fourth Kind is an interview involving an emotionally traumatized psychologist called Dr. Abigail Tyler, as she attempts to explain a series of hypnotherapy sessions that supposedly reveal the existence of an extraterrestrial, or at the very least paranormal threat, haunting each of her patients as well as herself. Each encounter is inventively presented as a side-by-side comparison between the alleged archive footage and the reenactment designed to fill in the blanks in a somewhat sensationalistic manner indicative of your typical fear-mongering televised documentary. Now, as a curious teenager, this movie legitimately terrified me because I'll admit I was pretty susceptible to its illusion, and after googling it when I got home, I was disappointed to find out that it was entirely fictional. While at the time I was confident that a lot of the footage was definitely fake, since I was still always ruminating on it supposedly using real material, there were a few curveballs thrown in the form of audio recordings that are just ambiguous enough to be at least a tangible source of believability. Obviously, as an adult, I can now easily see through the illusion without disrespecting its approach, because for as effective as the archive footage is, it's just too performative and cinematically clean to feel organic, and thus it arguably oversells it when it probably would have been more convincing if they had just toned it down a bit. Strangely, even though the context is much different, I think Cannibal Holocaust Lost did this framing switch much better, as the found footage feels grittier, unpolished, and reactive, and so it contrasts more distinctly against the classical direction, meaning for its time, it definitely appeared more real. Granted, it also helped that it was the first found footage film. I've mentioned this before, but I always think a good found footage film knows how to use the right amount of monotony to lull you in. Like with Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity, sometimes having nothing consequential happen feeds into your imagination and builds your anticipation, while in other cases, it also brings a sense of relief and decompression after emotionally overwhelming scenes. It is both a blessing and a curse to films like this, because to get to that one good, worthwhile scare, you have to play a very patient game with it, and more times than not, a lot of found footage films are hurt by this pacing conflict due to a lack of character or story worth keeping you invested. In the case of The Fourth Kind, there's a lot of slow, meandering scenes to make it feel natural and spontaneous to preserve the illusion of realism. But outside of Abigail, who we'll talk about in the spoiler section, the problem is that none of the other characters have anything interesting to say or do, and it's frustrating given how much emphasis is placed on the psychological. As such, because there's so little outside of scares, when it finally comes time for that, their short abruptness is going to feel very unsatisfying for some. That said, the archival scenes are incredibly visceral, and I personally recommend you watch them with earbuds or surround sound because during the side-by-side comparisons, it separates the audio to individual sides, which, while sounds jarring in premise, helps add to this obscure sensory overload that will make more sense when we get into the finer details of the story. Cynically, you could dismiss it as nothing more than a gimmick, but the level of commitment to what is ultimately its unique selling point is palpable enough to absorb you into its unpredictable intensity. So I think the best way to break up the story is into two plot lines, Tommy Fisher and Scott Stiskinski, and our main protagonist, Dr. Abigail Tyler. Obviously, it is your own discretion how much of this you wish to watch without spoiling it for yourself, but the major story spoilers won't truly begin until we talk about Abigail, as her experiences take up the entire second half of the film, when the alien abduction hijinks really begin to take shape. So the reason I called the film a psychological horror earlier was because, well, that's actually a more accurate description of the film. It spends a surprisingly long time focusing on people trying to confront their own unknown trauma and repression, rather than simply debating the existence of aliens or the paranormal. Sure, we have Sheriff August popping up to continuously antagonize Abigail about how most of these stories are fabricated for profit or attention-seeking, but the baffling ambiguity surrounding Abigail's patients, and subsequently her own experiences, does play into the concept of how people cope with petrifying things that shatter their otherwise rational worldview. It doesn't make much of a point about it, but I appreciate the film's effort to apply the genuine psychological debate surrounding alien abduction stories by implying concepts of false memories and sleep paralysis that likely had a significant influence on the story. For example, as detailed by Linda LACINA for History.com, one of the earliest accounts of alien abduction was the story of Betty and Barney Hill in September 1961, where one night while traveling alone, they claimed that they were followed by an ominous bright light and soon fell unconscious, awakening in a rough and messy state and unsure what exactly happened to them. Soon after, Betty started having vividly distressing dreams, where she was able to recount the description of the aliens, their ship, and their inevitable probing, which became the common template most of us know today. Eventually, the couple sought hypnotherapy by Boston psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Simon, who was stunned by the intense amount of emotional distress recounting their experiences gave them. And so, regardless of the truth, it's capturing that harrowing raw response that truly defines The Fourth Kind. However, as psychology academics Neil Dagnall and Ken Drinkwater, great name by the way, point out in their article for The Conversation, evidence has been linked to hypnosis influencing how these missing memories are recovered, specifically in the case of Betty and Barney Hill. While The Fourth Kind doesn't critique the concept as deeply as legitimate research covering the effect and causation of traumatic memories, repression, and so on, it certainly brings up at least a fragment of questionable validity towards these types of experiences. That is, before contradicting the ambiguity by doubling down on the alien abductions being real. If we look at Abigail's main patients, Tommy and Scott, we see similarities in their stories, specifically the recurring symbolism of a creepy owl staring at them each night, which we're basically told later in the film ultimately represents the aliens. It's an interesting piece of imagery at first because before the aliens become the confirmed threat in the second half, it's just as valid to suspect a monster or a demon or a ghost or whatever sleep paralysis monster you deal with. Even more so, that ambiguity extends into such abstract territory that you could just as well interpret large portions of the film as a muddy depiction of false memories and sleep paralysis. For the record, I am not an expert, nor am I claiming to give you the full picture of the science. I'm basing this purely on a few random, but supposedly credible sources, so make of it as you will. As Dagnall and Drinkwater continued, if we look beyond alien abduction stories as false memories and put the relationship between the stories and sleep paralysis into perspective, they share joint similarities. A sense of being awake, not dreaming, and realistic perceptions of the environment, the inability to move, a feeling of fear or dread, and the sense of another presence, perhaps evil or malevolent, are common symptoms. In fact, upon the film's initial release, psychology professor Chris French, who specializes in paranormal claims, wrote a scathing article for The Guardian discussing the film's irresponsible depiction of sleep paralysis. His point was basically that the film could indirectly encourage people to think their own sleep paralysis was the result of something paranormal, but while I've said before that people are unfortunately superstitious enough to believe these kinds of things, I don't think the film makes that bold of a statement. From what I remember, I don't think it even mentions the word sleep paralysis. Perhaps the film's biggest shocker is the outcome of Tommy's story, where after suffering from intense unending paranoia about voices coming for him, he ends up killing his family and then himself in a sudden murder-suicide, setting a remarkably grim tone moving forward. That's what really caught me off guard rewatching The Fourth Kind. I went in, somewhat ironically, with false memories of it being overly serious, far-fetched schlock, but I do not recall it being this fucking bleak. It does soften the blow slightly by having Scott's story end by him simply breaking his back as a result of hypnotherapy and briefly exploring the ethical conflict of Abigail's methods, but that's nothing compared to the perpetual trauma he has to deal with for the rest of his life, it seems. Given how sudden and fast-moving the film is, there is this unusual off-putting nihilism to it that truly cements itself in the second half. So brace yourself, spoilers ahead for Abigail's story. Frankly speaking, Abigail is the closest this film has to a fleshed out character, yet I still don't feel Milla Jovovich has the range to elevate the limited material she has to work with, especially when compared to the heartbreaking performance of Charlotte Milchard, who plays the real Abigail Tyler. The central mystery around her character is the death of her husband, who she believes was murdered by an unknown assailant, and ever since she's been dealing with PTSD while repressing the memory as deeply as she can. She struggles to cope alone and provide for her children, who have grown distant from her as a result of her inability to accept the death of her husband, and what her investigation becomes is a self-discovery of what actually happened. She is shown to be a believer in God as a coping mechanism, thus we understand her willingness to quickly embrace otherworldly ideas, but this is where things kinda begin to fall apart. Essentially, Abigail theorizes that the aliens do not want their victims to remember their abductions, hence their repression and amnesia, and since Abigail ends up getting too close to revealing the truth after translating an ancient language, an alien ship flies over her house and abducts her young daughter Ashley. She then attempts to communicate with them to bring her daughter back, leading to one of the aliens declaring itself to be a god, calling back to Abigail's spiritual beliefs, and later she awakens in hospital, believing she and her colleagues were abducted and seemingly probed. It is absolutely bonkers, but I would be lying if I said there weren't a few interesting ideas that spawn out of it. We tragically learn from Sheriff August that the reality behind Abigail's husband is that he committed suicide right in front of her, thus explaining her deep repression and trauma that's then exacerbated by the supernatural events. The ending makes an explicit point to frame Abigail as unreliable due to her increasing instability following the events of October 2000, leading to her complete inability to care for herself. The movie deliberately ends without a resolution. Abigail is deemed unfit and her other child is taken from her custody as she becomes the sole suspect in her daughter's disappearance before being cleared of all charges. Yep, that's right, her daughter never returns, and so we end up leaving the film both empty and angry as opposed to just scared. We know some supernatural existential shit happened, but there are so many questions left unanswered and literal plot holes within the events that perfectly fit within the theme common to alien abduction narratives. In the end, The Fourth Kind has a fair few neat ideas, but it never truly takes advantage of the culture or skepticism around it to create something that feels complete. It has the skeleton of a socially conscious exploration of the alien abduction phenomenon, yet without the necessary insight to make sense of it, due to its simple drive to deliver a frightening, if relatively forgettable, sci-fi chiller. So until next time, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Stay safe, stay away from UFOs, and I'll see you all next time.